Good morning, everyone. My name is Mel Hartley, and I'm the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on understanding vocational competence and industry currency. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Russell Docking, who is our presenter for today. Thank you very much, Russell.
Thank you very much, Mel, and thank you very much, Mel, for setting this all up and getting it in such good shape. And welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a huge number of people participating in this. It's a lovely way to work with you, although I always say it's nicer to be face-to-face. Welcome to this workshop. We're going to be looking at vocational competence and industry currency. And it's interesting to see that these are two parts of Standard 113, and yet the many RTOs can't quite distinguish between vocational competence and industry currency. And part of the purpose of today's workshop is to help you to see how they're different, because each of these concepts brings a different quality of industry expertise to the expertise that a trainer and assessor brings to share with students. So our program for today is to discuss, first of all, the credentials requirements of vet trainers and assessors, and then look at vocational competence and how one might demonstrate equivalence to vocational competence. The concept of equivalence is quite tricky, but it needn't be. We will try to make sure that it's clear cut and something that you can work with effectively. We'll probably take a little 5-minute break between vocational competence and industry currency, because it is a 2-hour workshop, and a little break would be a kindness. And then we'll move on to industry currency, what to consider in relation to that, professional development, which is in part about keeping your vocational competency and your industry currency up to scratch. And then finally, touch on the topic of supervision. What can you do when a person doesn't have all the necessary qualifications to be able to undertake their responsibilities as a trainer and assessor in the vet sector? It's important to see yourselves as basically the ground rock upon which vet stands. And we have a situation here where we have the Australian Qualifications Framework, which of course spans both vet and higher education, and gives us a specification of the level of sophistication of training products that come through the vet sector and also through the higher education sector. But then we have training packages which are drawn from an observation of what is required in workplaces. So because we're vocational in our education and training, we look to vocations, to what happens in the workplace, the work that people do, to define qualifications, and within those qualifications, units of competency. Those units of competency are specified according to a set of standards and requirements, be they units of competency or in some cases modules as defined, might be defined in accredited courses. All of this is overseen by vet regulatory authorities. There's ASQA, of course, as the national authority dealing with most states, and then there are the independent authorities in Western Australia and in Victoria. All these authorities are responsible to see that the standards for RTOs are sustained, and the standards for RTOs, which of course is a very familiar document to you, is what we'll be referring to from time to time as we go through this, because it's within these standards that the concepts of vocational competence and industry current industry skills are discussed. Then there's registered training organisations, and registered training organisations are organisations recognised by vet regulatory authorities to deliver training of the training products and to meet the standards to a standard defined by the standards for RTOs. And finally, but most importantly, there are yourselves, the qualified trainers and assessors. Without you, all of the above would be pointless. Fundamentally, if we are going to have a quality system, it's that interface between you and your learners that is so critical in terms of quality. So having qualified trainers and assessors is the most crucial part of the pyramid, if you like. As it happens, it's quite an accident that it's a pyramid, but the pyramid of quality that we have in the vet sector. And I might say, as an aside, that this is quite significantly different to what happens in higher education. In higher education, they do have the AQF, they have the Australian Qualifications Framework, because it does cover higher education qualifications. But they don't have an equivalent to training packages. In other words, they don't have national standards for qualifications. They don't have national standards for units of competency. They do have regulatory authorities, but they are very self-referential. That is, a university defines its own standards and then it can be assessed against its own standards. So they don't have standards for RTOs that are other than those that are self-referential. Universities do not need to comply with, therefore, with formal standards such as registered training organisations might. And it's not common for university lecturers to be qualified as trainers, educators or assessors. So the vet sector is quite different to the higher education sector, and you'll also see later on that in terms of outcomes from the training that is provided both by vet or in higher education, there is also a significant difference in terms of outcomes. So within the vet sector, we have a very different kind of structure, a very strong kind of structure for quality assurance. And all of those quality structures stand on the qualifications of trainers and assessors. When we look at the qualification requirements for trainers and assessors, we find those in standards, the standards for RTOs, clauses 113, 114, 115, and 116. And 113 is in three parts, and it talks about vocational competence. It doesn't say you have to have the unit of competency. It says you have to have the vocational competence. And that's kind of a let out because it basically says equivalent competence will be acceptable. That is, you need to have the skills and knowledge that you're teaching. The second item says that you need to have current industry skills. And current industry skills are clearly different to vocational competence, and it's part of the purpose of this workshop to clarify the distinction between vocational competence on the one hand and current industry skills on the other. And then you need to have current knowledge and skills in vet. And it's understood that, as in item 4 on this slide, that you are qualified as a vet trainer and assessor. That is, you've done your TAE and therefore have the actual qualifications. But the fields of education and training continually change. And so what is required under Standard 113C is that you sustain your current knowledge and skills in vet. That is, you keep up to date with them. And a workshop like this is one way in which you can do that. Standard 114 and 115 talks about you having to have the TAE qualification, either the latest version or the 2016 version, or the earlier version, the 2010 version, with other units of competency, the language literacy and numeracy competency, and the assessment competency, the diploma level assessment unit of competency. But finally, under 116, it talks about you need to be actively participating in professional development. It doesn't specifically say for all of the above, but it basically talks about professional development that contributes to your work as a trainer and assessor. So it would follow that all of the above is what is required. That is, you need to keep your vocational skills up to date, you need to keep your industry skills current, you need to keep your knowledge and skills in vet current, and that automatically means that you are keeping your vet trainer and assessment qualifications current. Now, all of this is discussed also in the TAC fact sheet. There's a fact sheet for this particular unit, for this particular workshop, and you'll find that's been discussed on page 1 of that fact sheet, and I draw your attention to the fact sheet as useful follow-up reading. So in the standards for RTOs, you can see precisely what I've just been saying. Clause 113 talks about vocational competencies and current industry skills. It also talks about other things, but we're now focusing on what's in our workshop today, and those are the two areas that we're going to focus on today. And you'll notice that when it talks about this, it talks about relevant to the level being delivered and assessed, which does mean that when we're talking about vocational competencies, we're talking about relevant to the units of competency that you're teaching and to the level of sophistication that you're teaching. And that would mean effectively an AQF level of some kind or other. And when it comes to current industry skills, again, it's talking about directly relevant that a training and assessment being that you are providing. There is another clause that makes reference to current industry skills, and that is clause 1.6, which occurs much earlier in the standards themselves, and there it's talking about industry engagement. And it basically says that you need to make sure that you are engaged with industry to sustain your current industry skills. So industry engagement is not just about industry looking at what you're doing, it's about you looking at what industry is doing so that you can retain your current industry skills. We'll come back to that notion after a little break when we're looking at current industry skills and what that has to say. But it's really important to understand a couple of things here quite early. The first is these are things that need to be sustained. These are not things that you acquire and then can just rest on that forever. You need to keep these qualities up to date, not the least reason being that the units of competency you teach also evolve, they change. Industry requirements change. So these are qualities that change and you need to change with them, which is why clause 116, which we'll touch on later on when we deal with professional development, is requiring you to keep up to date with these qualities. So these are things that you need to keep nurturing, things that you need to keep developing. The second thing I need to say is that you don't maintain these simply by being a trainer and assessor. Standard clause 1.6 is reminding you that in order to sustain these qualities, you need to be out and about. You need to be out in industry, seeing what is happening in industry. Being a trainer and assessor does not mean that you are sustaining your vocational competencies and current industry skills. You need to get out in order to make sure that those are maintained. So let's now look at the first of our two areas, vocational competence. And when we look at this, we can see, first of all, that vocational competence can be defined in terms of industry knowledge, expertise and experience in the units of competency to be delivered and assessed. They may be combined with relevant industry qualifications as well as relevant and current experience in industry. And they need to be considered on an industry-by-industry basis as well as a unit-by-unit basis. So if the unit of competency you're delivering is used by a number of different industries, then you as a trainer and assessor represent those different industries and you need to be aware of how the competency is used. That's more about current industry skills, which we'll deal with later, but it does stress the point that we need to understand where the competency is used in order to understand how it is a vocational competency within itself. So we need to remember all the time that all of these units of competency, and when we talk about vocational competency, we're talking about workplaces. We're talking about qualities that are found in workplaces. And indeed, units of competency, of course, are driven by and defined by what happens in the workplace. And that has a couple of implications. The first is that when a new unit of competency is created, no one has a certificate for it, and therefore nobody can teach it. But there are clearly people who have those competencies because they came from the workplace. And therefore we can talk about equivalence. We can say, well, although you haven't got this qualification because it has or this unit of competency because up till now it hasn't existed, Nonetheless, because you have been involved in the workplace in some way or other, you may well have this unit of competency, and therefore you could argue that you have equivalent competence. And we'll come back to that notion in a bit more fully a bit later on. The other thing about it means that you can talk about recognition of prior learning. That is, you can have a workforce who, although they're not certificated, actually do have those units of competency and need not be trained because they have the competencies which were used to define the competencies. So there's a lovely kind of natural justice here that since our competencies come from workplaces, come from what people do in workplaces, then that means that there are people who are already able to teach those competencies, and there are already people who could be qualified if we were to assess them against those competencies because they've been working in those same workplaces. So it's an important quality of VET that because we are industry driven and industry sourced, it does mean that we can understand the ideas of equivalence and competence because that's where these competencies come from. If we look at the next slide, then we can see that when it comes to vocational competency, there are basically two ways of demonstrating it. And the first is, of course, if you have the unit of competency itself. And here I would want to say that you either have the unit of competency or you have the unit of competency that is specified as equivalent in that unit of competency. And so it's quite possible that you have either the unit of competency or the one stated in that unit of competency as equivalent. If you don't have those, then you are going to have to demonstrate equivalence. And so we do need to talk a bit now about what equivalence of competency equivalence means. As I've already indicated, it is basically means that you may well have acquired the unit of competency, not actually acquired it in a formal sense, but it is in an informal sense, through work that you've done in the workplace or activities that you've undertaken since leaving the workplace. So when it comes to competency, equivalence can be demonstrated because you have the previous version of the unit of competency that's been declared equivalent to the equivalent one, or to the current one, I should say, in a training package. Or you can show that from your previous training and experiences that you can demonstrate all of the requirements of the current unit of competency. I notice that I've emphasized the word all here, because that means that you need to be able to show that you have all of the elements of competency, and therefore the performance criteria are things that you can demonstrate. All of any foundation skills that might be defined, all of any performance evidence requirements, and also all of the knowledge. Although I might say that knowledge is something reasonably easily acquired. And so the focus would tend to be on those things which take longer to acquire, which are the skills and the performance evidence requirements. So under those circumstances, when we look at equivalence, we say, well, the knowledge you can get easily. You can get it from Google, for that matter. You can get it from all sorts of sources. But the skills are things that you need to practice and perform. And so it's the skills that we would tend to focus on primarily in establishing equivalence. But this process of equivalence is not a formal assessment, and it's not an RPL process. So that at the end of the process of equivalence, you can't be awarded the unit of competency. The process we're going to describe here is a kind of mapping or matching process, and it does not meet all of the principles and rules of evidence. It fundamentally is not going to be a formal assessment process. And under those circumstances, what you can establish through equivalence is that you are fit to teach that unit of competency, but to be awarded that unit of competency, you would have to go through a formal assessment process. So thinking about the process, we recognize first that it's a mapping or matching exercise. And for some reason or other, it didn't change. I'll try again, there we go. And so the first thing to do is to list all the requirements of the units of competency. This is not unlike doing a mapping when you're planning an assessment process. But now what you're talking about is yourself rather than some assessment processes or tools or resources. So you start by listing all the requirements of the unit of competency. Then you need to list or match to each requirement your previous training and or experiences that demonstrate that you meet each requirement. And then secondly, you need to have an appropriate person verify the evidence that you provided. That is to make sure that the decision of equivalence is a decision based on evidence. Of course, if in that process you identify that there are gaps, well, you don't just sit around and say, oh, well, that's how sad. What you do is take immediate action to close them. And that means that you may need to go back into the workplace to have a look at what is going on, even to do what is going on, or you might need to take some further training. But what you can't have is gaps in your skills and knowledge, because after all, when it comes to working with these things, you're going to be training these qualities to students. So the rules of evidence apply to this process. First of all, validity. The verifier, first of all, assures that I have the skills, that you have the skills, knowledge, and attributes as described in the module or unit of competency and meet all the associated assessment requirements. Then there's sufficiency. The verifier is assured that the quality, quantity, and relevance of your evidence enables a judgment to be made of your equivalent competency. Thirdly, authenticity. The verifier is assured that the evidence presented for review is all your own work. And currency. The verifier is assured that the evidence demonstrates that your current equivalent competency, not some past history. This requires evidence to be from the present or from the very recent past. And I'm asked the question by Jared, who would be considered an appropriate person? Well, the appropriate person is a person who would be able to make these calls. That is the evidence that I'm looking at relevant to the qualities of this unit of competency? Is the evidence I'm looking at sufficient in terms of quality, quantity, and relevance? So the verifier is going to be a bit like an auditor. As an auditor, I'm able to review your assessment processes, even though I'm not an expert in your field, because I'm able to look at the assessment tools and I'm able to look at the unit of competency and answer the question whether or not what you're doing is valid, sufficient, authentic, and current in terms of the evidence that you would gather. It's the same sort of process. So the person who is an appropriate person is going to be a person who is vet qualified themselves, that is, they have the TAE qualifications. They not necessarily have the vocational competence of this area, but would be able to look at the evidence you're providing and the requirements of the unit and see that they matched. And of course, keeping in mind that there's a kind of bootstrap effect here. That is, fundamentally, when a new unit of competency comes into existence, nobody has it. Therefore, there is nobody who can be called a qualified trainer and assessor. And under those circumstances, equivalence has to be done, and that is by this process of analysis that we're describing here. So you can see that the process is one that is a process. I'm just checking what was some notes here, Mel. But it's a process that does require that kind of analysis, and therefore an appropriate person is going to be a person who can conduct that analysis. It will be within the organisation or from outside the organisation if you're a very small RTO, a person who maybe delivers in a different area but is qualified as a vet trainer and assessor and is able to make these kinds of judgments on the basis of evidence you provide. But it really is important that they be independent in the sense that it is not a self-assessment that you're doing here. It is you are demonstrating to some other person. Of course, what needs to happen then is this evidence, this record of evidence, and the judgment that has been made is something that would need to be able to be seen by an auditor to confirm the processes you're using. In some organisations, they have what's called a trainer and assessment competency matrix. A TACM it's the acronym that's used, and within that TACM, within that trainer and assessor competency matrix, is usually provided the evidence of equivalence. So you would see against a particular unit of competency that either the person has the unit, or they have the unit that is declared as equivalent to it, or they haven't, but have established equivalence through a process of that was described in the previous slide of listing the requirements of the unit of competency, listing and providing evidence of previous training and experiences that they can be used to demonstrate that they met each requirement. If there were any gaps, there would be evidence that you had taken action to close those gaps through either further training and or for some specific experiences. And then we would expect to see that the document was signed off by another person who was qualified in the vet sector, who had analysed the data against the rules of evidence to establish that there was valid, sufficient, authentic and current evidence of your qualities in relation to these components. So we have a couple of examples here that we could look at. And what I'm going to do is to suggest that you have a look at Activity 1. Activity 1 is a single page document. It has the green bands across the middle. And what it does there is provide an example of evidence for 5 units of competency for an individual. Now, this is one of the illustrations, and we do have a second illustration which we call Activity 2. And one of the units of competency which we'll focus on in a moment or two, which is design and develop learning resources. Those of you in the know will realise that that is now a superseded unit. We've hung on to it simply because for demonstration purposes, but of course you would not be looking at a superseded unit if you were really looking at equivalence in real life. But for the purposes of this workshop, we will stick with this one. In Activity 1, you have a number of units of competency: design and develop assessment tools, design and develop learning resources, evaluate a training program, and undertake organisational training needs and analysis. And fundamentally, what we're looking at in this example is evidence that's been provided in the third column of equivalence, and then some comments. And what we're asking you to do is to review this information and decide whether or not you think the evidence provided meets the rules of evidence that we showed you in the previous slide. And what we'll do is just take 5 minutes now for you to have a look at that, and then we can have a brief discussion on what you've observed. So for each of these particular requirements, the question is, has equivalence been demonstrated for each of these 5 units? We'll come back to that in 5 minutes. Let's take a break. Okay, folks, let's resume and see how you've gone with that review of Activity 1. And before we do, though, I understand from Mel that there are some questions that people would like answered. So, Mel, would you like to put those questions to me?
Yes, definitely. Okay, so first of all, how many hours is needed to complete in workplace for industry currency in childcare?
Okay, we're going to be looking at industry currency a bit later on, but if we're talking about vocational competency, it's a difficult one to answer. I think what we would want to look at is that within the units of competency, there is usually a specification of hours. If I recall correctly, I think it's about 120 hours. So one could take that as a kind of guide, a kind of benchmark. Because after all, what we're saying is that if a student has been immersed in the workplace for 120 hours, and I'm assuming 120 hours is about right, then under those circumstances, we could argue that if you'd had 120 hours of experience in childcare, then you would be on par with that required of a student. So look for the unit of competency to get some sense of what would be expected as a guide to what is expected. It also will come up when we're talking about current industry skills, because there is a question of immersion as well, because we would want to know that you had spent enough time in the workplace to understand not just what the vocational competencies were, but how those vocational competencies were used. So try as best you can to look for the unit of competencies that you're dealing with, and the qualifications with which you're dealing, because sometimes hours are associated with qualifications rather than with specific units of competency. What was the next qualification?
Okay, we've got two more questions.
Next question.
Yeah, Leonore asks, does this mean PE from other units of competency that you hold?
It could do if those performance evidence requirements were related. So it's always the case that qualities within a unit of competency are transferable so long as they're relevant. And one of the issues that we often have is that you can have two items in a performance or items in a performance evidence requirement that look like those that relate to another unit of competency, but are contextually different. And under those circumstances, they would not be transferable qualities. These are all judgment decisions that need to be made and justified. And in a sense, we are expecting that there is going to be a little bit of, how can I put it, I don't want to use the word sloppiness, but I do want to say variability, which is why this does not lead to the awarding of the unit of competency. It's because this is a statement of on the basis of evidence, but it's evidence that does not necessarily meet the full principles of assessment and the rules of evidence in an assessment context. So in the slide where I talked about the rules of evidence, I was talking about the rules of evidence within the context of equivalence. When we start talking about the rules of evidence within the context of assessment, you'll notice that the wording is slightly different because we're talking about something very much more hard-nosed as a process for determining actual competency. So here we're only determining equivalence, we're not determining competence. If we were determining competence, it would have to meet standard 1.8 and it would be a formal assessment process. So we will find here that, like the question about the number of hours in childcare, it's a question of, almost a question of persuasion. Is there a good case? Is there, if you like, a prima facie case that says this person has equivalent competence and therefore can be asked to deliver training to students who they will then assess against very formal processes so that competencies can be awarded. So you may have equivalence, which enables you to teach, but if you want the unit, you're going to have to go through a formal assessment process. And you can see that there's a nuanced difference between the two. And so the questions like the transfer of performance evidence requirements or the hours of time being spent is a matter of judgment and at this stage not a formal assessment process. Were there any other questions, Mel?
One more question from Mark. So no need to go granular, down to the performance criteria level.
No, but you would need to be able to, Mark. So you would not, in a formal written sense, go down to performance criterion level. But if you say you have a unit, I beg your pardon, if you say you have an element of competency, it's because the evidence shows that the qualities of that element have been seen or have been demonstrated. Now, or have been used within the context of the workplace. So it's beholden to the person doing the analysis to say to that independent person who's doing the analysis, that appropriate person who's doing the analysis, to be able to say to the person seeking equivalence, you claim to have, through this experience, this element of competency. Are these qualities of what you did? because the performance criteria are basically the way in which the element is defined. And therefore, if you are claiming the element, you must automatically be claiming its performance criteria. And so you wouldn't map that out, you wouldn't write that out, it would be tedious to the extreme, but then you should not claim an element of competency unless you can say that in my experience, either in the workplace or through training, I actually have demonstrated all these qualities. So Mark, it's not so much that you do it, it's that you have the potential to do it. And as an auditor could reasonably say, if they had a doubt about an individual's equivalence, they would reasonably be able to say, yes, but are all these qualities that with which you're familiar and that you're able to perform. So when we look at activity 1, thank you for those questions, incidentally. When we look at activity 1, you can see that indeed the evidence is awfully thin. So if we look at the responses to these, have equivalence been demonstrated to the first one, which is 502? What are the answers, Mel? Okay, so the no's are winning, but there are some people, and there are no responses, a large number of no responses, which could mean that people haven't gotten to the question, or it could mean that people are not sure. But the response is more strongly no than yes. Basically, the evidence provided is not sufficiently detailed enough to be able to make the call. If we look at the second one, which is design and develop assessment resources, can we get a poll on that, Mel?
Okay, I'll show the responses now.
Thank you, Mel. Okay, now this time the answer's more strongly in the yes direction, and the answer would be yes because this person basically has the equivalent unit. So that the TAE-DES 502 unit replaces its equivalent, which is the TAA-DESS 02B, 502B. And in the 502 unit, it basically says the 502B unit is equivalent. So we would accept that as equivalent because that is what we're being told by the training package. What about the next one, the evaluate a training program? Okay, there's a bit of a mixed view here. They're fairly close in terms of voting between yes and no. The fact is that the detail is not there. In other words, there hasn't been a listing of the unit requirements, and so it may well be that this person is in fact equivalent, but what we don't have expressed on this page, on this single page, is enough evidence to be able to say that they really are equivalent. So we would need to dig a lot more deeply, and that is indeed what happens in activity 2. So if we go to activity 2, perhaps we might get a clearer response to what is going on in terms of their particular unit. We're going to focus now on just one unit of competency, which is I think if I move to the next slide, you'll see what it is in activity 2. This is the TAE-DES 505 Evaluator Training Program. And here we have much more detailed information. So you'll see in the unit column on the left that the elements of competency are listed, and then the performance evidence requirements are listed. And then there's evidence of equivalence, attached documents. And now this goes on for 2.5 pages. Well, in actual fact, yes, 2.5 pages. So what I'll ask you to do now is to take a few minutes to have a look at these 2.5 pages of evidence in activity 2 and see to what extent that answers the question of whether or not the person is equivalent. When we look back at your results, you were not sure. Half of you said yes, half of you said no. But now you are provided in this document with full details for the mapping of this unit of competency. Would like you to come back with your opinion in a number of minutes. Let's allow ourselves another 5 minutes to have a look at this. Thank you very much, everybody, for your responses. The comments about why you would say no are very apt comments, and they do show an awareness of the importance of such things as authenticity. So one individual is saying, because I can't see the name of the person now, but one of you was saying that you would need to check authenticity. Another person was saying I'd need to check on the size of group. And of course, that check that you're referring to there is the kind of check that the appropriate person, as we call it, would need to be making. But the vote now is much more strongly yes. Before it was a bit equivocal, now it's strongly yes. And there are some no's because as a number of people are saying, I would still need to provide a bit more information. But when you start looking at this, you can see, first of all, that the unit list on the left-hand side in the left-hand column focuses on the skills components. That is the performance evidence, the PE, the performance evidence, and the elements of competency, the 4 elements of competency. With relating back to the earlier comment about the performance criteria, when it says plan and prepare an evaluation, which is the first element of competency, it will have a set of performance criteria, and we would expect to be able to explore the evidence provided in the second column, or I guess it's the third column, in order to be able to establish that the performance criteria were implicitly or even explicitly met through the evidence that was being provided. There's also, of course, a third document column, or fourth column, which contains the attached documents, and that is further evidence which we don't have in front of us now, but that you could go back into. And maybe that would help us with answering questions like what was the size of the group and whether or not there was authenticity in the evidence. You'll also notice that on the final page of the final page, which I think I can show you, that there was a discussion of review notes. All 3 projects address the requirements of the unit and have involved different methodologies. The ABC reports clearly show review processes and improvements to the process in the following year. Discussions with the contract manager and chair of the stakeholder group have been recorded and can be accessed at this link, which is part of that authentication, so that the reviewer has gone beyond just the documented evidence, has gone back to people who are involved. And these conversations confirm the authenticity of evidence. So you can see that the independent reviewer is checking authenticity, which is important. Discussion with project team members confirm a consultative approach was used. And then there's a link here with the interview recordings, which enables you to be able to follow that up. So what we have here is, as one of you has indicated, a much more comprehensive statement of evidence that is related to particularly the skills requirements. It's interesting to note that the knowledge requirements have not been listed. And I know some RTOs also list the knowledge requirements, but I don't want to downplay knowledge, but it is true that knowledge can be relatively easily acquired. Skills are hard to acquire. They take a lot of time to practice and ultimately to demonstrate through performance, whereas knowledge is something much more readily attainable. So the focus on skills is the focus on those qualities of the unit of competency which are most difficult to acquire. You'll also notice that this person has been able to associate the unit requirements to the workplace activities. And that, of course, is totally legitimate, because at the end of the day, these units of competency are supposed to be a reflection of workplace activities. So what we're seeing here is that a unit of competency has come from the workplace, and now the person's using a workplace to demonstrate those qualities of the unit of competency. But it's not necessarily a formal process. So it doesn't necessarily, in a formal assessment process, that meets all the requirements of standard 1.8. So it will not lead to this individual being awarded the unit of competency, but it will enable us to say this person has equivalent unit of competency. There's much more effort, involved than in the example used in activity 1. Vastly more information, really. But at the end of the day, we're going to be saying to this person, you can now train others in this unit of competency. You can do so because we've done a careful analysis of your experience and of any previous training that you've done. That analysis has revealed that you have the qualities necessary to be able to train and assess. But if you actually want this unit to be awarded, you're going to have to go through a much more formal and extensive assessment process than is here. But given their responsibilities for training others, it's not unreasonable that 2.5 pages of summary, plus all of the documentation in the 13 attached documents, and plus the interviews that the reviewer did of those involved in those activities, all of that adds up to very comprehensive judgment of equivalence that would appear to be quite safe. Linda has quite rightly reminded us that knowledge evidence is listed in this activity 2. And my comment before was that you don't always find that knowledge evidence is listed. In this case, it is. But when you look at the evidence that is provided, it is evidence about activity from which you might be able to infer knowledge. But knowledge is has a different set of qualities in terms of the kind of evidence you might need to provide. But when you look at the evidence in relation to the elements and performance evidence, you can see words like plan, collection, report, and so on. You can actually see in the attached documents project plans and data collection tools and project reports. You can see the words that describe activities that have been used to demonstrate the skills and the performance evidence components of the unit of competency. Knowledge is a little bit more difficult to discern, and you would need to ask specific questions in order to establish knowledge. But what you can see from that is that this individual is able to represent themselves to their students as someone who has the vocational competence. And I must say that it's something that is particularly unique to the vet sector. My daughter, who was a university lecturer for many years, was a dietitian and was teaching dietetics. Many of her colleagues who are teaching dietetics, in other words, training dietitians, had never themselves been dietitians. They had done their qualification, and then they'd gone and done a master's degree, they'd gone on and done a PhD, but they had not worked as dietitians. So they were training dietitians, even though they did not necessarily have the vocational competence, or for that matter, the current industry skills of dietitians. In the vet sector, we have a very different view. If you're going to be teaching workplace-related skills and knowledge, you must have that workplace skills and knowledge. And so our position in the vet sector is very strongly that you must be able to do what you teach. And that is a message that comes through the standards continuously, but also strongly through the concept of current industry skills. And that's where I want to take us now. Within the context of the standards in Clause 113B, it talks about training and assessment is delivered only by persons who have current industry skills directly relevant to the training and assessment being provided. And the definition in the glossary says that current industry skills are the knowledge, skills, and experience required by vet trainers and assessors, and those who provide training and assessment under supervision to ensure that their training and assessment is based on current industry practices and meets the needs of industry. So interestingly enough, they've changed the words, in a sense, current industry skills to a knowledge of current industry practices. Further on in the definition, it talks about current industry skills may be informed by consultations with industry, and we touched on that before under Clause 1.6, and may include, but is not limited to. So may include means that not all of these things need to be done, and there might be more on the list. First of all, having knowledge and or experience using the latest techniques and processes, possessing a high level of product knowledge, understanding and knowledge of legislation relevant to the industry and to employment and to workplaces, being customer and client oriented, possessing formal industry and training qualifications, and training content that reflects current industry practices. So fundamentally, that little list of items, which is from the glossary, pages 7 and 8 of the standards, gives you a clue of the sorts of things that current industry skills might address. It's not so well defined in a way as vocational competence. But what you need to understand that as a trainer and assessor, when you stand before your class and act as a trainer and then later on as an assessor, you represent the whole of your industry. And I don't mean just your local regional industry, or if you're an enterprise RTO, just your enterprise. You represent national standards because these are national competencies. So your current industry skills need to be much broader than your experience, much broader than your vocational competence, because now you're talking about all the different ways in which the competency you're teaching might be used in industry. So that gives us another way of looking at what current industry skills are. Clause 1.6 makes it clear that you can acquire and maintain your current industry skills through a range of strategies to engage with industry. Notice it says a range of strategies, so it could be that you are keeping up to date on the web, it could be that you're visiting work sites, it could be that you're attending conferences, a whole range of strategies that you might use. And indeed, we'll look at those a bit later on when it comes to professional development. But when you visit industry, what should you be looking for? What should you be trying to learn? And it's fundamentally this notion that of taking the competency you teach and looking at how it's used in real workplaces. So you can ask these sorts of questions that are shown on this slide. Firstly, how is this competency used by a worker to achieve workplace outcomes? So it's not, you need to see the competency in context. Now, not just in one industry, but across a number of industries that use the same competency. How is this used by a worker then in different workplaces? So in different workplaces, the same competency might be used in different ways. How does it relate to other competencies used by the worker? Very rarely do we perform a competency in isolation. Most of the time, we are performing competencies in harmony with other competencies. We might prioritize competencies, we might have to blend competencies, we might have to find some way of integrating competencies within ourselves. So the question needs to be asked, how does this competency fit into, if you like, the network of competencies being used by the worker? And that helps us to get out of our competency silo. One of the problems that we have as trainers and assessors is that we tend to think of competencies as having hard boundaries, where in actual fact competencies are kind of multicellular. They connect to other competencies. That's how they get some of their value. And therefore it's important that we understand how the competency we teach relates to other competencies the person's learning, maybe with other trainers and assessors. Then it needs to be, you need to ask, how does this competency relate to the competencies used by other people in the workplace? And they could be other workers, they could be management, they could be junior workers, they could even be clients or customers. Because when you are working with a competency as an individual in a workplace, it's how your competencies interact with the competencies of other people that often make them effective in terms of producing workplace outcomes. And how has this competency changed over time? How has its use changed over time? Is the same competency now used with different equipment and different resources, or even in different contexts? So what it really is doing is saying, and remember that it says that you need to be able to show this current industry skills in relation to the competencies you teach. It's really taking the competency you teach back into the workplace and saying, how does this competency actually work? Then that will instruct you a great deal on how you can teach that competency, because you can now immerse the competency in the kind of context of the workplace. And that is something you can share to your students. It's something you can incorporate in your training materials. It's something you can incorporate in your assessment processes. It means that you're lifting the competency out of a kind of isolated cell, its own silo, if you like, and starting to see how the competency is used across the board. And there are lots of benefits from this, and many of those benefits are benefits that will actually enhance your status as a trainer and assessor. Firstly, of course, it makes sure that your training and assessments are relevant based on real-world situations and can reflect industry's needs. In other words, the purpose of competency is not the competency itself, but how that competency is ultimately deployed in the world of work. It provides you with confidence that you are up to date and demonstrates to others that you are an up-to-date trainer and assessor, providing best practice ideas for students, industry and peers. It enhances the reputation of the RTO amongst industry. It improves the confidence and goodwill because you're being seen in industry. What industry is saying, this person is one of us. They know what we do. They understand what we do. They understand how we work. And that in turn means that industry is going to associate more strongly with the VET system and accept and appreciate the output of the VET system, that is your graduates, because they know that your graduates have been developed by a person who has not just a vocational competency, but also an understanding of how that vocational competency works in terms of current industry practice. So there is a huge benefit in pursuing this quality of current industry skills. But I hope you can see too that this makes it different to vocational competency. It's not just that you can do something and understand how it works and so on, but that you can actually show how it works within the real world of work. And this has to be done on a competency by competency basis, a unit by unit basis. And what it's basically saying here is that you need to be able to show the qualities of vocational currency and of industry currency on the basis of each unit of competency. And so we need to ask ourselves, how can we actually be confident that we have current qualities, vocational currency and industry currency? What does that mean?
Hi,
and it depends
on cut in.
Yes.
I've got questions in relation to industry. So Mike is saying, what is my industry as an AEL CGEA lecturer? What is considered workplace, for example, teaching a maths unit or a migrate English? And again, proof of currency that I still know English?
That's a very good question, and one which I feel comfortable about answering. Interestingly enough, your industry is when we're thinking about industry, we need to think about where is our graduate going. So if our our graduate is going out into the workplace, such as into to an automotive workshop, then then that is our industry. In the case of ESL and in the case of other education programs that, if you like, are fundamental and significant foundational training for an individual, where they're going is into VET, into further vocational education and training, which means that you need to be talking to the next set of lecturers. You need to be asking the questions of the next set of lecturers. How are these mathematics skills used in your industry? How are these English skills, these language skills used in your industry? In other words, in that further training. So for someone who's involved in ESL or in training in fundamental mathematics or training in those sorts of areas, the industry for them is the next level of vocational education and training. And so you would be talking not to people out in the workplace, but people in the VET sector itself, because that's where your students are going. And that's really important. Indeed, it's we need to consider always where is the student going after they've done our training. If they're taking the competency we taught into the workplace, then I need to talk to people in that workplace. If they're taking the competencies I'm teaching into further education or training, then I need to talk to people in further education and training, because that's where my graduates are going. Those are the people that I'm preparing these graduates for, and those are the contexts for which I'm preparing these graduates or these students. So it's a very good question, and when you think about it, not too difficult to answer if you think about it in those terms. When it comes to currency, we need to basically ask ourselves, well, what is considered to be current in the training package? And some training packages tell you. So, for example, in construction training package, in the plumbing and services training package, they talk about the last 2 years. So currency for them would be within 2 years. Within, say, health, we can look at nursing. Fundamentally, there would say you have to have current registration. So you can see that in some circumstances, industry itself, either through the training package or through some external registration process, tells you what is considered to be current. But if you do not have that, then you're going to have to develop your own process to determine what currency is. And again, this is something with which you need to talk about with industry, that you need to talk about with industry. And so it'll depend a good deal on things like how quickly the industry is changing in terms of technological innovation. So, for example, if there's new materials or new processes or new equipment and new protocols, and your industry is changing rapidly, you're going to have to be able to keep up to date with those, and currency will be quite a short period of time. If, on the other hand, you're in a very stable industry, one which has not changed much, does not evolve very much, then you can stretch out those periods of time. There could be changes to legislation and regulatory requirements, which of course mean that you've basically got to keep up to date with that legislation and regulatory environment. There could be changes to industry practice, which might be because of technological innovation, but they could be because of changing the work environment, the changes in the workforce, changes in client demands and expectations. All those sorts of things means that you're going to have to be more active within the context of keeping up to date through your industry engagement. There could be new and emerging skills and specializations. So there could be niche industries being evolved, new ways in which things are done. Under those circumstances, again, you're going to need to be fairly active. But you're also going to need to look out for things that are actually in decline. It's not just a process of learning about new things that are coming in, but almost a sense in which you've got to start forgetting about things that are no longer used. And so you actually need to be able to see not only where there are areas of growth, but where there are areas of decay. So this means that you need to engage with industry more if there's a rapid environment of change and evolution, less if there's not. But I would argue that you probably need to be able to check on what's going on every 6 months, maybe report every 6 months or every year on what you've observed in terms of changes in industry. And one would expect to find that those observations are then reflected in your delivery materials, your PowerPoints, your handbooks, but also in your assessment resources. In other words, it really is critical that these resources are kept up to date, not just with changes in the training package, but also changes within industry. Because at the end of the day, what you're doing is certificating a person as being ready for industry. It's important that you sustain an awareness of what that industry is, so that you can prepare students adequately for that industry as it is now. I might say that in my very first involvement with the vet sector a long time ago, one of the things that we found was that there were lecturers who had not touched the tools of trade and had not been back in industry for 20 or 30 years and were teaching practices and using materials and equipment which was vastly out of date. And industry was beginning to turn its back on formal vet training because it was basically saying, well, you haven't evolved with us. The training organisations were kind of dinosaurs. They were kind of museums of past industry practices. What industry needs is vet to be up to date and aware of what is happening in industry now, and hence the word current in industry skills, not just the industry skills that you had when you left industry, but current industry skills that reflect industry practices and processes and equipment and ideas of now. And that really does mean that you need to sustain currency to be able to make sure that what you deliver is going to reflect what the student is going to find when they leave the training and move into the workforce. So the process you need to first of all go through is, what does currency mean in my industry? And in some industries that will mean you need to keep a very close tab on what is going on. In other industries you might be able to be a bit more relaxed, but fundamentally what you need to do is to be fully aware of how your industry is changing. What knowledge and skill and industry practices do I need to keep up to date with? And so fundamentally you need to start then saying, well, if these are the changes in industry, what do I need to do to keep up to date? And then you need to think about the sort of activities that you need to follow to keep up to date. And in activity 3, we have a list here of sorts of things that you might do. And we're going to, in a moment, look at professional development. But what you can see is that these sorts of activities listed in activity 3, things like being involved in workplace shifts and in workplace experience, or professional memberships, or attending conferences, or providing training or assessment in the workplace, or any other sorts of things that you do. These are things that enable you to see what is going on in industry to keep up to date. So what we'd like you to do is to have a look at of those processes, which you might call professional development. They're certainly part of professional development, and reflect on the pros and cons and whether or not those strategies would work for you. So let's just take 5 minutes now to have a look at activity 3 and those approaches that are described there. Mel, I'm not too sure how we can get feedback on this. You may have some really beautiful ideas about how it can be done, but let's see what we can do with this activity.
Yeah, sure, Russell. Just pop your answers in the chat box, guys, and we'll come back for a discussion.
Okay, folks, I think I might cut in at this point. Although we did say 10 minutes, I think we might be beginning to worry a bit about our agenda. But we are getting some really interesting comments here, and I'd like to share with you some responses to that. And if I just go back up a little bit here on my list of comments, it has been, I think it was Lenore has said, it's stressful finding the time. And I understand that, Lenore. I think it's, this is an extra demand. Some people are saying, well, their employer is allowing them time to get out into industry, and others would appear to be not. So it is an extra demand. May I say in relation to that, first of all, approach 4, which is providing training or assessment in the workplace. If you are providing training and assessment in the workplace, and it may be that you have apprentices or trainees, part of the process could be not just spending time looking at the trainee or the apprentice, but also spending time looking at the workplace for your own benefit. Now, what I mean is you're already out there. So if you are out in the workplace to look at a trainee or an apprentice or a person doing workplace experience, then you can use that time not just to look at the student, but also to look at the workplace for your own benefit. Another way in which you can do it is to form a kind of collaborative group with other trainers and assessors, so that you can share experiences. This doesn't all have to be experienced by you firsthand. You may well find that there are others who are out in the workplace with whom you can talk. So there's this notion of sharing experience and observations. There's also mention there of a logbook. I might say that I've lost the question or the comment, but what I would be urging you to avoid is a very detailed diary. You'll get some people who say, "Oh, what I need to do is keep a log of, the date and the time and the person I spoke to, and where I was, and so on." The critical thing is not so much all of that, but what did you learn from that experience? So it would be more valuable for you to keep a narrative of observations, just so that you were able to record things that you either were changing, or things that were developing, or things that were in decline. Just keep a narrative going, and then and after maybe 6 months or so, go back over the narrative and that collection of ideas and observations that you have made, either yourself or have heard through other people, or have seen in the web, or in some other way, even sometimes as a customer yourself. And look back over that narrative and then say to yourself, are there messages in this narrative that I need to incorporate in my training materials? Are there messages in this narrative that I need to incorporate in my assessment strategies? So that fundamentally what you are doing is keeping a kind of running conversation with yourself. So it needn't be a logbook in the formal sense, but there does need to be a sense in which you sustain a narrative. I keep a little bits of paper and so on. When I hear of something interesting or useful, I write it down. I gradually build up a collection of ideas which I can then incorporate in what I'm doing. And it's just that sort of notion of notes to yourself, a narrative rather than a formal log. So what we're seeing is that people are finding the idea of workplace shift or experience as perhaps tricky to get to. But what I'm suggesting to you is that you can share that with others. The great con then is finding the time, but the great pro of it is that you are really seeing the real workplace. And what's happening there is you are going into the workplace and seeing what is done. There's really no substitute for that. It's something that you need to do or need to draw upon through other people. Professional memberships can be really valuable. But of course, what now you are now doing is getting information secondhand. It's been processed and before the information gets to you. So it'll be how the profession wants to represent itself rather than what is really going on. And so you might find that within the context of conferences or professional activities that it talks about PPE requirements. But when you go into the actual workplace, you might see that those PPE requirements are not really being met. That tells you something about how you need to train and how you need to assess. So that what you want to do as much as possible is to get things firsthand. And one way, of course, of doing that is making use of time that you're in the workplace for training and assessment, if indeed that is what you do. So you can see that there are strategies that you can use to build up a narrative over a period of time, which enables you to review and modify and enhance the relevance of your training and assessment materials, which is what it talks about in Standard 1.5 and 1.6a, But of course, that narrative now becomes part of your current industry skills, so it also enables you to meet the requirements of 113B. I'm going to have to get a life. I keep on reciting these numbers. So when we come to look at professional development, we are basically seeing that in Standard 116, that there is in fact an expectation that you enhance your VET skills and knowledge, your vocational competency, and your current industry skills. And that is basically what you need to be able to do in order to be very confident that what you're doing is relevant to the requirements of industry now, and therefore you can provide the right kind of learning environment for your students and the right kind of assessments context for your assessment processes. And in that way, you are providing exactly what the whole idea of a quality assured system expects. It is true that the whole system stands upon your shoulders, and therefore your shoulders need to be properly informed about what is going on in VET, what is going on in terms of your vocational skills, and what is going on in terms of the use of those skills within the world of current industry. But there's a lot that is reflected too in the way in which certification is done. So the outcome of that quality pyramid that I talked about before is certification. That is, you are going to train and assess and then certificate students as competent and ready for the workplace. And this is another significant difference between higher education and vocational education. In higher education, a degree means that you've been involved in a body of learning, and that there is evidence in the form of assessments that you have acquired that learning. So it's self-referenced and backward-looking. It doesn't say what that learning is. It just says that you've been involved in it for a period of 3 years, if it's a degree, and that you've passed the necessary tests. But VET is quite different. VET says that this person has been trained and assessed, not necessarily trained because RPO would be just assessed, and is ready for the world of work. So VET looks beyond the training to say, is this person that we're going to graduate ready for the world of work? Whereas in higher education, it doesn't say that. It says, has this person succeeded in doing the teaching that we did, whatever that was? So there's a very different idea in terms of certification, which means there's a very different idea about what it is to be a trainer and assessor. In our case, in the VET sector, because we are going to certificate a person who's ready for the world of work, we ourselves have to reflect that world of work, both in our vocational competency and in our current industry skills. And that really does make a huge difference in terms of what VET requires and why those clauses are so significant in the standards, and why we have a fact sheet and why we run a webinar to talk about those particular requirements. But I might say, if I may, that it's something about which you should be very proud. It does mean that as VET trainers and assessors, you have extraordinary qualities and extraordinary attributes which enable you to perform in this extraordinary area in the preparation of your students and your learners for the world of work. But not everybody who comes to the world of VET has all of these qualities. And in particular, when a person comes with vocational competence and current industry skills, but does not yet have the VET skills and knowledge, the first on our list here, then it is acceptable within the standards for you to be able to supervise that individual so that they can deploy their vocational competency and their current industry skills to deliver training and assessment. But there are very strong conditions associated with that. The first is that they must be supervised, and that is that they cannot operate independently or as a trainer and assessor. And they must be vocationally competent and industry currents. So you can see that in these lists here for training and for assessment, that in both cases, the vocational competence and industry currency is critical requirement. And when you think about it, the acquisition of vocational competence and industry currency is a long time thing. It takes quite a while to achieve vocational competence and to sustain industry currency. It means also that the person who doesn't have themselves the trainer and assessor qualifications or competencies can work as part of a team with someone who does. And so when it comes to training, this person is provided with advice and is monitored to assure quality. So the supervisor provides advice on how training materials could be managed and on how the training materials are delivered and monitors them to assure quality. You need to have a skill set to be supervised, and so fundamentally the standards do require that you have the enterprise trainer presenting skill set, but fundamentally if you don't have some skill set to work with, you can't even perform as a trainer. When it comes to assessment, you can collect evidence during an assessment process, but you can't make the assessment decision. You cannot determine the assessment outcomes. That has to be done, at least you can, but not on your own. You would have to be working in partnership with a person who is trainer and assessor trained, or in this case particularly assessor trained. So that we accept the notion that you can collect evidence if you don't have a training and assessor qualification, but you can't make a judgment. That has to be done at least in partnership with someone who is assessor trained. And so we need to talk about this notion of supervision. And when it comes to thinking about a supervisor, we are basically saying the person who is acting as a supervisor, and this is covered in the standards in clauses 117 to 120, is responsible and accountable for the quality of training being delivered. So that individual who is being supervised is responsible for following instructions and for taking advice and for having vocational competence and industry currency, but the end quality of the end product is the responsibility of the supervising trainer and assessor, and also the supervising trainer and assessor makes all the final decisions about assessment outcomes. I might say that there's a sense in which, of course, we do understand the notion of an assessment partnership where one person brings the assessment expertise and the other person brings the vocational competence as well, so that and the industry currency as well. So it may be that the assessment decisions are made jointly by the person being supervised and by the supervising trainer and assessor who has the trainer and assessor qualifications, but the person being supervised cannot make those judgments independently. So there we are with our session, and I'm really happy now to field any kinds of questions. We need to just reflect on the fact that there are some resources that you can access. Of course, there is the standards for RTOs themselves, and TAC also produces a user's guide, which addresses each of the standards within the standards for RTOs and talks about the way that can be interpreted, why the standard is important, what you can do to demonstrate compliance with the standard, and what auditors are looking for when it comes to compliance with the standard. But the first part of each discussion is the most important, which is why is this standard important? And that's been much of the basis of the discussion today in this webinar, as to saying, well, it's not just about compliance with vocational competency and current industry skills. It's the reasons why they matter that makes it important for you to attend to them. Then there's a fact sheet on vocational competence and industry currency, which provides you with everything that we've shared with you today but something you can reflect on later on. There's a fact sheet on industry engagement because, as you'll have seen, a key part of this process is maintaining contact with industry. And there are a whole range of strategies discussed in that fact sheet. And for those of you who are time pressed, hopefully when you look at that fact sheet, you'll find that there are strategies which are not so time demanding that you can utilize for industry engagement, and not the least of which I referred to before, which is the sharing of your observations. That narrative that I referred to before that you can build up through industry engagement is something you can share with others and others can share with you, so that together you build up a really good picture of what is going on in industry. There is, of course, a fact sheet on trainer and assessor requirements, and there is a document called Keeping It Real, Industry Currency of Trainers in Queensland. That is another document that you can access in order to keep up to date with what's going on. Note the phrase, though, keeping it real. It's really going back to that notion that as trainers and assessors, we must not become enclosed by the unit of competency. We need to understand that unit of competency and how it relates to the real world of work. So keeping it real is a really good phrase for that. So I'm happy now to stop at this point and to say thank you very much for your participation. I hope you found it useful, and I'm happy to stay here and deal with any questions. So if you want to leave now, feel free. But if you would like to stay online and deal with any questions, then I'm happy to stay online as well. Just draw your attention to the fact too that TAC is also able to respond to questions and issues. TAC is made up of a very skilled group of individuals who can respond to questions. They may redirect questions to auditors, but in much of the time they're able to deal with those questions themselves. So here are, in this slide, the contact details. And you'll also see a feedback survey item that Mel may want to refer to before we leave. But I'm happy now to stay on and deal with any questions.
Thanks so much, Russell, for today, and thank you everyone for your participation, and thanks everyone also for bearing with us as we had a few technical issues. If you can complete a survey, that would be wonderful. I've put the link in the chat, but you can also use the QR code on your screen to answer the survey. A recording of this session will be available on our website and also on the YouTube channel shortly. And of course, the certificate of attendance will be emailed to you in a little while. So thanks everybody. And once again, thanks and have a great day.